today we really wanted to focus in on the 2D Zeldas.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for me, Zelda is 2D. I really enjoy the 3D stuff, but for me, Zelda really is 2D. What's your thoughts on 2D Zelda in general?
Yeah, so love them. Great series. Grew up with the 2D Zeldas, played those a lot before I ever touched a 3D Zelda. So I kind of wanted to just, have a conversation today, this first kind of podcast for Zelda month about the games that started it, right? I mean, it seemed weird to jump right into talking about 3D Zeldas when, yes, they're all part of the same series, but they're so distinct. And there's so much to say about the 2D entries that it seemed like a good starting point for us to just have a conversation about those games. What do they mean to us? Which ones are our favorites? Why do we like them? And how do they stack up in this modern era against the 3D Zeldas out there? Now, when we're talking 2D Zeldas, though, right, we kind of need to clarify a little bit, right? Because I would consider the Link's Awakening remake, a 2D Zelda, even though it's 3D sprites and stuff like that, right? It's still a 2D Zelda. It's still a top-down isometric Zelda game. I think that's kind of the key here. If the camera doesn't pan, ground level behind Link and fully, maneuverable, I would say it counts for our purposes. Does that seem fair? Does that make sense?
That's fair. Using 2D very liberally here, but I think that's okay.
Yeah, we're talking gameplay,
Because the
as
gameplay
opposed
is very
to
similar,
design.
right?
Yeah,
For these games.
yeah. So, I grew up with the first game I ever played, or that I remember playing, was the original Legend of Zelda on the NES. Right, that's to me the first like distinct memory I have of video games. I know that I had like dabbled with an Atari a little bit as a kid. I had played through some of the early Mario's, or I should say, I had played some of the Mario's with my family when I was little. But the one that I remember the most is that gold cart, right? That gold Zelda
Oh yeah.
cartridge that was so distinct, and still to this day is one of the most unique game cartridges ever, crafted. I know they did that for a couple other games, but that was like the first one I'd ever seen. And so I vividly remember as like a like a 5 or 6 year old, that cartridge, and watching my uncle play the first one, playing a little bit of it at an age where I had no idea what was happening or what I was doing. So that was my first like video game experience. Obviously I don't count it as my first Zelda, for reasons we'll get into in a little bit here, but that's like my first gaming memory. So Zelda is a series that like from the inception, for me, is like defines video games. I mean, what about you? Where did you jump into the series? What was your first exposure to Zelda?
I feel like I probably was exposed to the original and probably A Link to the Past, but I don't really remember them. I didn't have them
Yeah.
growing up, but I did have Link's Awakening on my Game
Yeah.
Boy. And that was one of the coolest games I ever played in my life.
Hmm.
Like having Chain Chomp in that game and
Yeah.
carrying it around on a leash, basically. I thought that was just unbelievable, and the whole motif of uh, getting rupees from cutting grass.
Yeah.
Like I loved every minute of that.
Hmm.
But yeah, so I don't remember the first few games on the home console all that well, and I didn't buy copies of them until much later. So I don't think I had them. I probably played them at a friend's house, but I just don't have like a vivid memory of ever playing them for the first time.
Yeah. That's interesting. So when you say Link's Awakening, are you talking about like the original Game Boy, or are you talking about the DX version that came out later on the Game Boy Color?
No, I never even played the DX version.
Interesting.
Um,
Interesting.
I thought about getting the Game and Watch. I think you got the Game
Mhm.
and Watch.
I do. Yeah, I have but that's just got Zelda 1 and 2 on it.
Oh, I thought it had Link's Awakening too.
Mm-mm.
Oh,
I
never
don't
mind.
believe so, unless I'm mistaken. I think it just has the first two, but it's been a little while. It has those two for sure, but I haven't really messed with it since then. But
Oh, okay. Well, anyway, I thought it had Link's Awakening on it, so I was like gonna get it just to play Link's Awakening DX or whatever it's
Mhm.
called, for the Game Boy Color, but I just never did. And when Nintendo came out with the remastered or remake, not even a remaster, the
Yeah, really a
remake of
remake.
Link's Awakening a couple of years ago, I guess. That was really a blast from the past for me and for a lot of people. But
Hmm.
that being the first Zelda that I really remember playing through, that I finished,
Yeah,
that really meant a lot to see that. And I thought the claymation was really cool. Actually, that was one of the amiibo that I had to buy. I don't really collect amiibo. I've got maybe 10 of them, but I had to have this one. Had
yeah,
to
that's a
have it.
good one. That's a good little guy. Um, that game was a blast. We'll talk more about that in a little bit later in this discussion. But it's interesting that Link's Awakening was your first experience, like the first real experience with Zelda. Because mine was actually, like again, played, dabbled in the original on the NES, got nowhere. Mostly just like the first three screens around the the opening minutes.
Yep.
Um, Picked up a sword, picked up a shield, and then figured nothing out, as you do in those original games. But my first experience of actually playing through a Zelda game was, in fact, Link's Awakening DX on the Game Boy Color. I didn't have a original Game Boy. I didn't get a Game Boy until the Color came out, and the game that I got with it, the first game that my parents bought me, was Link's Awakening DX. Came on like a black cart, which I remember
Yep.
being really different than all of the other Game Boy carts that I had seen up until that point. Which again would go on to be like those colored carts and stuff were something that I really loved. The gold NES, the black Link's Awakening DX, and then obviously when we get to Pokemon, you got your reds, your blues, and all those with the colored cartridges and stuff. But
You know, I,
that was a game that I remember as a kid playing through, and um, you know that game at the time was so difficult for me.
yeah.
I probably spent 2 months on that game, playing it pretty much every day, and never ended up beating it. I was young at the time, like it had just come out, and I was pretty young at the time, so I don't remember it super vividly. But it's funny that you mentioned Chain Chomp, because that was the point in the game when you first get Chain Chomp that I don't know what happened, but like I soft locked myself, or at least in my brain at the time, at that age, I had thought I had soft locked myself. I could not figure out where I was supposed to go. And this was the pre-internet days for the most part,
Yeah.
right? Like we had dial up, you had GameFAQs had just gotten off the ground, I think, but you couldn't really look stuff up. You couldn't really you had to talk to people, and I didn't know anyone else who had the game. So I remember never beating it until I was much, much older. But I played it for dozens and dozens of hours, just kind of running around the field and attacking enemies and stuff like that, just for fun.
It's so funny you mentioned that because I vividly remember my first time playing through it hitting a dead end with the chain chomp too.
Hmm.
Couldn't figure out what to do. Just ended up hanging around with the chain chomp, going around the little village,
Yeah.
and back down to the beach, just trying to figure it out. And eventually, I got through it. I don't remember how exactly. It had to be
Hmm.
like a friend telling me what to do.
Probably.
But so there were a couple of things I wanted to mention about your story, as similar to mine. Um, these were the days with like game companies were actually trying to sell you strategy guides.
Yes.
So they would put these really tough sections into games where you would get like little subtle hints about what to do, but it
Hmm.
wasn't clear. And it to me it feels like it's all an attempt to sell a strategy guide or to get you to
Right.
call the Nintendo hotline. And I can't stand that. I just really hate that part. Um, so that was one thing. Another thing you mentioned about was like this being a tough game to figure out
Yeah.
and to get through. Um, for me, it was a big transition to play like an action game like this versus like an RPG. We talk a lot about RPGs, and the more you play those, the better you get. So you can really suck and not be able to beat a boss, but if you just try long enough, you'll eventually level up. Right? A game like a Zelda game, you just have to figure out how to use the tools and how to get
Yeah.
better. It's a
Hmm.
it's a little bit of a different approach that took me a little while to figure out. So that was the thing. And the last point I wanted to make, and then I'll let you respond to all of these. But the last point I wanted to make was I think people today underestimate how much time we spent with Game Boys.
Yeah.
You know, like not having a TV of your own. At least I didn't for a really long time,
Right.
and my console was shared. The Game Boy was mine, so a lot of my gaming
Mhm.
happened there.
Yeah.
We're the Pokemon generation, that first generation
Right.
Pokemon.
Right. Yeah, and so that's why, like, I still, when I think of the Game Boy in any of its iterations, right? It doesn't matter if we're talking original Game Boy, if we're talking all the way to 3DS. The first thing I think of when I hear that name is the that black Link's Awakening DX cartridge, because again, it's still just kind of firmly burned into my mind, right? My first real game, right? That I played, my first real Zelda game, I should say, right? I'd played quite a
Yeah,
few at that point, but um, this would go on to be a series that I've played just about every entry in to completion, right? I mean, there's a few that I kind of missed, and we'll talk a little bit about those, as this month goes on. But for the most part, I've played pretty much every entry through to completion, including some of the spin-offs and things like that. But I still find that, to me, the with the exception of maybe Wind Waker, right? The games that I have a lot of nostalgia for and really find myself wanting to revisit from time to time generally fall into the 2D Zelda games, right? These original kind of isometric top down games, and I think a lot of that has to do with their emphasis on puzzles, right?
mm.
Which again, I'm not saying that the 3D Zeldas don't have puzzles. They do. They absolutely do. They're
They're
core.
different though.
Yeah, they're core to the DNA of Zelda across both, 2D and 3D Zeldas. But the 2D puzzles were something that, for me, for a long time, were like one of my favorite parts about those games, because they've got a lot of fun, unique, and interesting puzzles that they um, had to get really creative with because of the limitations of the 2D field, right? They had to get really creative with items in ways that I don't think the 3D games have ever managed to kind of hit, right? I think that
Hmm.
item management and play in 2D in the 2D Zelda games is always more interesting to me. I like the way they mess around. It seems like a lot of the 3D entries have kind of their set rotation of items, with like one or two added on each entry that don't really do a whole lot different than stuff we've already seen. And that's similar in the 2D, but I feel like we get more variety and more um, interesting takes on these items in the 2D entries. And that might just be my incorrect memory of these games, but I think back to these experiences, and um, I think about something like the Rock's Feather, right? Which is
Hmm.
such an innocuous item when you think about it, right? All it does is let Link jump, right? Which is a feature in the 3D Zelda games that is just, yeah, he can
It's
he
just
can
there.
jump. He just does it, right? It's typically not assigned to a button except for in like Breath of the Wild, but he can jump by running at a platform and he just goes, right? And you don't need an item to make that happen in a 3D game. But you are limited with no ability to jump over gaps for a very long portion of these early games, and it makes puzzle solving far more creative in that way, because it involves a lot more of the environment and the terrain, and maneuvering through the world in interesting creative ways, before you get the ability to kind of jump gaps, right, and progress over minor obstacles like this. And so there's a sense of progression in these
Hmm.
2D Zelda games that I think is more compelling, I guess, than the 3D. I like the arc a little bit more in the
Totally
2D.
agree. And we talked about this a little bit when we did our Minish Cap episode.
Mhm.
Plug for our Minish Cap episode if you haven't listened to that. But we talked about the button layouts.
Yeah.
With 2D Zeldas, basically you have two buttons. Sometimes you
Mhm.
get more than that, but generally with most of the games you have two buttons, and you're constantly switching items in and out.
Yeah.
And I think that thinking through that as a player was much more interesting. Okay, what do I need
Yeah.
to have to get through this puzzle? It may not be the item that I am typically using, right? Like maybe I
Yeah.
need to switch on the boomerang for this, or maybe I need to switch out the boomerang for the bow and arrow or something. I think that being limited in your controls has a really interesting effect on puzzles in a
Mhm.
way that some of the 3D ones, I mean, you've got with 3D games, just this huge button layout, um, and it it can almost be a little overwhelming
Yeah.
for me, like all these buttons do all these different things. But with the 2D Zeldas, it's much simpler. And
Mhm.
I mean, you spend more time in menus, but you're making decisions in menus that I think are more interesting than just having like all of the options available to you
Mhm.
on a gamepad. I don't know if I'm making sense, but in my mind, it
Yeah, no.
feels it feels more fun to do it on like a 2D Zelda. And I mean, while I'm talking about controls, if you've played Breath of the Wild lately, after coming back to it, after a long
Mhm.
period of not playing it, those controls are awkward,
Yeah. Yeah, it's a
super
tough game
awkward.
to jump back into, right? Which is never the case with a 2D Zelda, which I like.
Never the case.
Um,
Yeah,
but to your point, right? These sort of micro decisions that you're making with inventory management. Not to beat a dead horse here with Resident Evil, right? I think one of the joys of that series in the early games and even some of the later ones is like menu management becomes like a mini game in and of itself.
that's a
And
skill.
Zelda has always done this, right? In very specific ways, but it also creates interesting split second decisions when it comes to dungeon, not just like dungeon traversal and solving of puzzles, but like combat as well, right? Because the interesting thing that 2D Zelda games do is they tend to be I think, at least I find, more interesting with their enemy weaknesses and how they encourage Link to exploit certain enemy weaknesses, like enemies that, the bomb is best for, ones that the boomerang should be used on, when you should, pull out a bow instead. And yes, these I'm not saying none of this is in the 3D ones, but I think in the 2D ones, because of you know the choice of having to pick two items at a time, right? You can enter some rooms in a 2D Zelda where the immediate best approach to clearing that combat gauntlet or challenge is not super clear. The
Yeah,
you know
the enemy
the
itself is a puzzle.
Yeah, and so the enemies become a bit more of a puzzle, I think, in the 2D games than they are in the 3D. Because the 3D, there's some visual language that tends to work really well in their favor. Like you tend to know which enemies will work with what items just by looking at them and observing them a little bit. It's not
And what you
as
got
immediately
lately.
right. It's not as immediately clear in the 2D ones, right? And sometimes they'll mix a couple enemies together that have different weaknesses. And the fact that you've only got two items that you can use, one of those typically being your sword, means that you've got to make sacrifices and decisions to figure out, what is the best way to get through this room with the least amount of health loss, right? And the least
Yep.
amount of items used, especially if I have to use something like my bows, my magic powder, or my bombs, right? And that's something that I always found really compelling in these games is, you know, um, I think more often in a 2D Zelda game, I find myself in a room in a dungeon where my health is low, my items are limited, I'm running low on stock, and I come up against an enemy that I have to get really creative with figuring out how to solve. Um, I never find item economy to be that big of an issue in the 3D Zelda games, but I definitely feel that way in the 2D games. And that pressure of having to select the best tool for the job at a given point is something that I've always really, been fascinated by with those games.
I totally agree, especially when it comes to expendable
Mhm.
items like your bombs, like your arrows. Like you've got to be careful about those things. Yeah, like I know we just talked about Resident Evil in a previous pod, but
Mhm.
it is a lot like a survival horror game where you don't know where you're going to get replenishment of your bombs again.
Yeah.
Like you can bomb as many walls as you want if you've got 30 bombs or whatever, but eventually you're going to run out, and you might need those in the next
Mhm.
screen.
Mhm.
It gives you an interesting challenge that I don't think that we've really gotten with the 3D games.
Yeah.
Maybe we can't get with the 3D games.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting because you look at Breath of the Wild, right? Which, and I think this really started with A Link Between Worlds. So it really started in the 2D games, right? A Link Between Worlds introduced the item loan system so that you could approach dungeons in whatever order you wanted to approach them, right? But you still had restrictions based off of certain items that you needed in your inventory to clear certain locations, right? But it was a little
Right.
bit more open ended because you could buy and loan items to yourself in that game if you needed them. And then Breath of the Wild comes along and says, well, what if we just remove most of the items from functioning as items? You know, we take out the hookshot. We don't need that anymore. We change the boomerang to just a weapon, right? That doesn't really solve puzzles so much anymore. It can in a few instances. You know, you can throw it at a switch or something like that. But for the most part, it's just a weapon that
Yeah, you're
does
much more
damage.
reliant on the Sheikah Slate than
Hmm.
any particular item.
And in doing that, though, right, a big criticism of Breath of the Wild from a lot of Zelda, like long-term Zelda fans, is it dumbed down the puzzles. It reduced the sort of complexity and intensity of some of these puzzles that could be designed and curated around a very specific approach with a very specific item, which again people also complained, you know, by the time of Majora's Mask, that it was getting stale, right? That I got the bomb, so I know this is going to be the bomb dungeon. I got the boomerang, so I know this is going to be the boomerang dungeon, right? And like all
There's
of
so
the
much truth
puzzles
in
will
that,
evolve.
though. You
But
know,
and it is, but at the same time I felt that in making those decisions Nintendo was able to, like, they were able to hyper focus on making the puzzles that you solve with those items far more interesting than in later 3D entries. And so that's why I still find a lot of joy in playing through the 2D games, because you know the combat's nothing of difficulty or interest in a 2D Zelda game. It's pretty straightforward hack and slash fare, but the puzzles are so fascinating and interesting and well done. And I just want to talk a little bit about the world map in the 2D Zelda games, because that's something that I absolutely love. The way the world maps work with these little, like, often like gridded, maybe 4x4 3x3, you know, maps that you fill in as you enter new areas and put little dots on, and then at the end you've got this nice little just like picture of a map that you can look at, and it's just one big square with the entire world on it in this nice little neat, you know, um, square that tells you exactly where you've been and what you know still have to do. Um, it's just a really cool, like, visually. I find the 2D games to be really pleasing to look at.
I
They're very
like
enjoyable to kind of just absorb.
I like any game that lets me slowly unveil the map.
Hmm. Yeah.
Like, I think we're both playing Xenoblade 3, the DLC right now, and
Hmm.
Xenoblade does a great job of that, right? Like, as you go through the map, you slowly
Yeah.
reveal what's there. And the 2D Zeldas do a great job of this. A
Yeah. And
really great job.
but at the same time, it's not just enough. That's not enough for me just to reveal the map, because I you talk about the Xenoblade map, but I hate that map
Really? Oh my god, I love
because
it.
once it's unveiled, all it is just kind of like a monochrome, uh, you know, brown map with names of places on it and some map markers all over it. Same with Breath of the
Yeah,
Wild. I hate the Breath of the Wild map because you unlock the squares and it's just a brown map with some markers on it, right? Whereas the old 2D Zelda games had these like full color like maps, right? Like the map to A Link to the Past, right? Like when it's fully filled in, you know, you can tell what the biomes are. You can see what, each of the areas kind of looks like.
that's true.
It's like a fully rendered artwork of the world. And these 3D games, modern games have really pulled away from that and have, no, I shouldn't say that. That's dismissive of a lot of really good maps out there. But, um,
They're more
I
like map maps.
yeah, yeah,
Manhattan.
that's what I'm thinking. Like the Xenoblade games and Breath of the Wild are good examples of this. That they're just not interesting, fun to look at maps in the way that the 2D Zeldas almost always are. We were just playing Minish Cap, and gorgeous, gorgeous little tiny map in that game. Um, but the other thing that's interesting is, we were sitting down to do this episode, and I was thinking about, Zelda recently, and in my mind, I thought, there's definitely more 3D Zeldas now than there are 2D Zeldas. But I was going back, and it looks like the 3D Zeldas are still outnumbered by the 2D Zeldas. If we're just talking mainline, we still have more 2D
Hmm.
Zeldas currently than we have 3D Zeldas, because I believe it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, 11 2D Zeldas to
And that's not counting
8.
remakes, right?
No, no, versus 8 3D Zelda. So it's interesting because I was thinking about this recently and how much I wish we would get another 2D Zelda. And I guess that's kind of like the next point I want to make. A question I want to ask you is, do you think it'll ever happen again? Do you think we'll see, be it a remaster, remake? I mean, there was rumors that the Oracle games were going to see a touch up. Um, do you think those teams are still out there doing that, or have we fully moved in with the era of the Switch? Have we fully moved past 2D Zelda games into 3D?
All right. I'm going to try to be Notre Dame here. Oracle of Ages, Oracle of Seasons are going to come to the Switch Online onto the Game Boy, and
Hmm.
Nintendo will call that done. I think we could get a um, Link to the Past style remake of
Or Link's Awakening
maybe,
style remake?
yeah, sorry, a Link's Awakening style remake to A Link to the Past
Hmm.
or the original. Like I can totally
Interesting.
see them doing that because they've already tested the market with Link to the Past. It performed super well, sold really well.
Yeah.
I could see them doing that with the originals.
Hmm. Yeah, I do wonder because it seems like the pace at which Nintendo has put out like their their core lineup has really kind of slowed in recent years, I
Hmm.
think, right? I mean, we've only had one Mario on this. I mean, unless you count Bowser's Fury, but that's more of like a DLC, right, than a full
That's pretty
fledged
typical, though.
experience,
We
right?
usually get one big 3D Mario per console now.
Yeah, but I think the Switch is going to be around longer than we think, right? And it already has
Oh,
kind of been,
okay.
right? And so I'm not saying we won't get like a Switch 2, but I think that they're going to continue to create for the Switch for quite a long time. And so I'm surprised that we haven't started to see, a new Donkey Kong, a 2D Zelda, another Mario, any of those big ones, in a few years now. We're getting two Zeldas as of a week from this record. We'll have two Zeldas on the system, um, and we don't even have any news about another Mario. We don't know if it's coming. We don't know if it's in development. Nothing's been confirmed,
Sure.
and so I'm curious to see if 2D Zelda um, is even in the cards with the rate at which they're producing Zelda games. Like, do they have multiple teams working? Are they going to are they going to pawn it off on a third party developer or another in-house studio that doesn't typically work on these games, or are they just going to say, hey, this is it now, we focus on one gigantic Zelda at a time,
Yeah, I
and
don't
that's the
think
future?
so. I really don't think so. I don't know what they're gonna do. I mean, it's worth noting that Nintendo did combine their handheld and console
Yes.
divisions, right? Like the people who used to only focus on the handheld Zeldas are now, I guess, not explicitly just doing that.
Yeah.
But I think Nintendo, I can't remember if they've said this before or if just the community thinks this, but they want a Zelda a year, and
Mhm.
eventually they're going to run out of remasters or
Yeah.
remakes of like the 3D things, and they're going to have to do something else. And I think that's a natural place to go with the 3D things, whether it's a like Link's Awakening style remaster. Keep saying remaster, remake, or maybe something brand new. I don't know. It's tough for me to consider them doing something brand new though.
Yeah.
This soon because there's so much left on the table with these older games that aren't accessible, and I think they want to resell those if they can.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, I mean, no, there's no question that we're gonna get ports to the Nintendo Switch Online. I think that's obvious.
But
Um,
beyond that, right?
but beyond that, yeah, I don't know that we ever see a fresh 2D Zelda, at least not in the immediate future, and that's kind of a bummer to me, right? Because I'd love to see another Link's Awakening, another Link Between Worlds, which I loved. I loved the Link Between Worlds. I thought it was a great game. I'd like to see another. stab at the series like that. Unfortunately, that just doesn't seem to be in the cards at present.
Why do you think that?
Just the pace of development on Tears of the Kingdom has me believing that they've decided that with the Switch being the all-in-one handheld and home console, there's less incentive to go 2D because they're not selling games to a handheld exclusive market and a console exclusive market. And that seemed to work really well with the 2D, 3D
Hmm.
split. Now that they've fused those markets and the handheld is capable of the console experience, I don't see them scaling back to
All
these
right,
smaller experiences.
let me push back. We've seen it work with Mario and Metroid. They've done 2D and they've done 3D.
I mean, yes, I agree, but they haven't yet done it really with Zelda, unless we're counting the Link's Awakening remake, which I guess maybe we
I think
can.
we should.
But that's not what I'm wanting, right? I don't want
You're talking about like a
remakes.
brand new, like
Yes,
totally.
yes,
Well, hey, let me
front
ask you this.
scratch 2D
Let,
Zelda.
let me ask you this. Would you consider like a new game in the style of Link's Awakening to be like a new 2D game, or is that just a new top-down 3D thing?
Yeah,
Like,
that's a
would
new
that
2D game. When I'm talking 2D, I'm talking the Link's Awakening remaster or remake as well. That's a 2D game. It still plays top down. It still plays 2D, um, but I'm not talking doing that with A Link to the Past.
right? You're talking about a totally new
Yes.
story. I don't know, man. I'm kind of torn about that because it seems like with Metroid Dread being so successful, you're bringing this old franchise back after I can't remember how many
Mhm.
years, but like a decade or something. Would they not want to do that with their biggest IP or second biggest IP?
I want to be wrong. I would love to be wrong. Obviously, I want to be wrong on
I want
this.
you to be wrong too.
But
I want that as well.
I'm I just I don't know if it's in the cards because again, Breath of the Wild, such a huge seller, continues to sell well, is selling like hotcakes again because Tears of the Kingdom's right around the corner. Um, they are making hand over fist, cash hand over fist on Breath of the Wild and the 3D entries. Tears of the Kingdom is going to do the same thing. Tears of the Kingdom is going to have a huge life cycle because whatever Switch 2 comes out, that's going to get a port over to that with updated graphics and better quality. So it's going to
Plus
sell.
DLC.
Yeah, it's going to sell double on that. They're going to keep their efforts there, I think, because I think that's where the money is right now. Though, again, I would love to see something, you know, else come in. Um, I guess I would consider, Cadence of Hyrule a fresh 2D Zelda game. It's very
Sure.
different gameplay style, but yeah, it's a fully fledged Zelda game, and I think it stands up quality wise with all the other 2D games. But that's made by a third party studio, right? It's a licensed Zelda game. It's not an in house first party
Well,
product, and I'm curious to see if we'll get that.
let me stop you there. Minish Cap or the other Capcom Zelda games. Like,
Well, no, I still consider those. I'm just saying I don't know that. Are we going to get one?
sure,
Are they out there, talking to Capcom again, saying, "Hey, you guys have been doing a lot of really good work in the last couple of years. You guys want to make another 2D Zelda for us?" I would love to hear if that was the case, but
but you would still count that, even though it's not a
100%.
Nintendo developed thing. Okay, yeah.
Yeah,
I was
I'm not
thinking,
saying that they don't count. I'm just saying I'm I'm curious to see if I don't. It doesn't seem like Nintendo's doing a lot of those types of relationship for mainline games now. They're doing a lot of spin-off games with
yeah,
third party companies, but it seems like anytime a new third-party entry in a series comes out, it's mostly been spin-offs. Now, Dread again is proof that they're still thinking about it. So I'm hoping that in the next couple of years we'll see something. But I feel like with how quiet Mario has been, how gone Donkey Kong has been, that there's a whole lot more that's on the docket before they get back around to a 2D Zelda. And by the time they get back around, they may just decide to go 3D again and give us the next main entry into that series. So that's kind of
Yeah.
where my concern is.
Man, just as an aside, can you believe we've gone this entire generation without a new Donkey Kong game?
No, I hate it. It's awful. We'll talk more about that soon, I'm sure, but
Yeah,
it's terrible.
future episode. It's just it's but to the bigger point about these franchises that to me really aren't very well represented on the Switch. You know, Nintendo's one of Nintendo's best selling consoles ever. It's
Hmm.
just really surprising that we don't have anything like that. And with the 2D Zelda, like even waiting so long to put some of the like Game Boy Advance games on Switch Online, right? Like,
This is, yeah, I think we're in a really bad place right now with regards to the love of the port, the remaster, right? And because, as you point out, there are so many Zelda games that are still not on the Switch, I think that's where most of the focus on 2D Zelda is going to be, getting that full catalog onto the Switch first before we start seeing. So again, maybe it won't be till the next console, right? Till Nintendo's next console, but I'm hoping that we will see another 2D Zelda. I just don't know that it's going to be anytime soon.
yeah, before we move on to our next block here, another sort of disappointment for me with Zelda and some of the 2D Zeldas, you can't actually buy them for the Switch. A
Yeah.
lot of them are going to be locked on the Nintendo Switch Online, which will one day be gone, right? Like
Hmm.
I'm not going to be able to play Minish Cap, my save cop or my
Right.
save data Minish Cap. I would gladly pay for like a Mega Man style collection of these Zelda games, and
Right.
Nintendo refuses to put them out.
Yeah. It's bonkers. I don't know. We'll see. We'll see what happens. I think that the 2D Zelda series is one that has a ton of fans, a lot of diehards, especially in the wake of the disappointment that a lot of long-term fans felt with Breath of the Wild. Again, still one of the best-selling games of all time, hugely popular. Most people loved it, but there is a subset of the Zelda community who absolutely did not mesh with that game. I think a lot of those players probably really appreciate and love the 2D games as well, like myself. So I'm hoping that this style of game sees a resurgence after Tears of the Kingdom. That hopefully there's a smaller studio, maybe another Capcom developed game in production already that we don't know about. But there's really no way to know until some announcement, whatever future direct Nintendo's got planned. But
Yeah,
in the meantime, I think it's important that we get back to really talking about these 2D Zelda games as why do we love them? Which ones do we love? So why don't we take a break, come back, and we'll do a tier list. Does that sound good?
tier list. Let's do it.
All right. All right, Justin. So we are back. We are going to now move into a segment in which we are ranking our top 2D Zelda games. So this is Nintendo Watchers 2D Zelda tier list. So if you are, a big fan of the series, if this is, a franchise that you love, if you're a fan of the 2D Zeldas in particular, hit us up with your thoughts on this ranking. We're going to go through the 11 mainline 2D Zelda games. Now, we're talking The Legend of Zelda. Uh, we're talking The Adventures of Link, Link's Awakening, Link to the Past, Ages and Seasons, Four Swords Adventures, Minish Cap, A Link Between Worlds and Triforce Heroes, the most recent of the sort of 2D Zelda games. Now, in this ranking, we will consider all remakes, remasters, ports, whatever, under the umbrella of the single game. We're not going to be ranking Link's Awakening on here 3 times. We're not talking the original, the DX, and the remake. We're just talking Link's Awakening, right? The package, all of it. So, I want to think about this list as not only, which of these games do you like the most, but which ones do you genuinely, holistically think are the S tier, the A tier, the B, C, D tier Zelda games? Now, I'm curious to see if we end up with anything in the D tier. I think that it's fair to say this is a quality series. It's been around for a long time. People love these games for a reason. So don't be mad at us if we, have a couple of high ranking Zeldas in here, and we've got very little in the low ranking categories. But Justin, before we get into this, any questions, concerns, or thoughts on how we're going to approach this?
No, just to echo what you said, I doubt we'll have any D's in here, but I don't know. We'll see. I don't know.
Yeah. So we're going to just go in chronological order, I think. Does that sound all right with you? We'll
Yeah,
work our way from
do it.
the NES all the way up to the 3DS. That'll be the plan here. So the first up on the list, obviously, is The Legend of Zelda for the Nintendo Entertainment System. This is the game that started it all. The probably biggest inspiration on Breath of the Wild out of all the Zelda games, I
Good
think.
point.
One of the biggest, most inspired games of all time. And thoughts on where we place this? We both talked about this a little bit. We like this game. We played this game at various times in our lives, both a little bit when we were younger, a little bit when we were older. Have you completed this game ever? Have you
Oh
finished
yeah.
it? Okay,
Oh yeah.
perfect. So, um, just give me your initial, instinct. Where are you putting this on the tier list? Where does
Feels
the
like it has to be S or A. But I think because it lays the foundation for literally every
uh-huh.
other Zelda ever, I'm leaning towards S.
So I want to say S tier for the reasons you've pointed out. I also am hesitant to drop it to A purely for how well it holds up. This is a game that we've talked about. Zelda Nintendo, I should say, was designing games in this era to be used with a strategy guide or to have you call their tip line, right?
Yeah.
And this game, out of all the games on this list, I think needed that tip line. I don't know how you go into
Fair.
this game blind and complete it. I couldn't, even as an
Well,
adult.
it's just random walls you have to
Mhm.
bomb.
No
Like maybe
visual.
nothing visual. Maybe you don't need it to like actually finish the game, but you definitely
Mhm.
need it to complete it.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of that where little bait and switch from Nintendo there.
Yeah, so I'm hesitant to place it in the S tier just from an accessibility standpoint. Like, is it, would you recommend it to someone who's never played
No,
the
no, I wouldn't.
series?
That's fair.
And that's what makes me think maybe we drop it to A tier for now. We can move it back up, but I think for
All
now
right.
we start with the A tier because we don't want to go out the gate with an S tier and then have to scale back what constitutes an S tier. Does that
That's
make sense?
that's totally fair. I do think though, it putting the first one at an A tier and not an S really just speaks to how good the games
Yes.
got later.
Yeah.
And I think that this is a really solid game. If there were never any other, installments in this series,
Mhm.
we would look at this as like one of the greatest games of all time.
Right.
Still,
Right.
so
So
with that, I'm okay with
okay.
the A tier.
So we're putting that in A tier. This next one's going to be a quick one. Zelda 2, The Adventures of Link. That's going into S tier. That discussion is over. So we're moving on to Link's Awakening. All right, Link's Awakening, Game Boy, Game Boy Color. We got the
We're really not
DX.
going to talk about. We're not
No,
going to talk about.
it's S tier. And uh, and so
I know
we're
you're a big
we're on
fan.
to Link's Awakening. We're talking about Link's Awakening now. So uh, we had 3 versions of this game. We've got the original on the Game Boy Color, which has the DX version, which added some extra dungeons, a little more like remakes on some puzzles and stuff. Kind of like not really a master mode, but kind of.
Yeah, a little
And
bit.
then we had the remake, which it's a remake, but it is a faithful remake of that game. It is essentially one to one, right, with
Almost
the
to a
original.
fault.
So I would actually classify it as a huge remaster, right, more than a remake, because I think remakes they add stuff to it. But this was both of our first like fully invested Zelda experience. Um, I think it holds up really well. I think it
Mhm.
makes some adjustments to the visual, right, fidelity of the series, the visual language of the series to help players understand where and how to progress.
And it was an entire Zelda game on a handheld.
Yeah, which is huge, right? And
Huge. I mean, like you've got these huge games on the NES and the Super Nintendo, but to have a complete Zelda adventure on the Game Boy, I
yeah,
don't think I appreciated it then. Absolutely do now.
hmm
I mean,
and
it's shorter than some of the others, but
but
it's
it
still
plays
a
so
very
well.
full. It plays well. You've got all the items. It's a really full adventure.
I think one element of this series or this game that is underrated, it comes back a little bit in some future games, but it was really underrated at the time, was the side-scrolling sections, right? Which
Yeah,
were a carryover from Zelda 2, right? And something that kind of merged the first two Zeldas in a way, right? Visually and stylistically. Um,
and like put Mario stuff into it. Remember the
yeah,
Goombas were in the yeah.
Kirby's in there, right? Kirby's an
Oh,
enemy
that's
in the
right. I
game
forgot about
at
that.
one point. So it's got a lot. It's also wacky. It's also one of the
It's
weirdest.
wacky.
And look, when we get to talking about the 3D Zeldas on the next episode, we're gonna have a very long discussion about Majora's Mask, I think. But I love the wacky Zelda games, and so for me, this is like at least an A tier. I don't know that I could drop it into the B tier because it plays really well. It still holds up. I'm talking like the DX version. You don't have to play the remake. The original still holds up. And aside from like we've talked about in the past, some confusion over lack of clarity on where to go in some places, it's miles better than the first two games at guiding the player. Right.
For sure. I know, I completely agree. It's A tier.
Yeah. It also introduces a lot of really cool items that would become mainstays of the series going forward, right? So that's a big one, right?
And I know we've already placed it, but it's a totally different story than you get with any other Zelda game. Every other Zelda game, I think I'm right. Every other Zelda game is, defeat Ganon or his stand-in, right? And
Most of
save
them, most of them. I
Zelda,
mean, Vadi, yeah, you're right. They're it's pretty much the same. Beats in a lot of them.
but not this one. I mean, this one you're waking up a fish who's dreaming,
It's
like
real good. Yeah.
it's
Again,
weird.
it's
It's
wacky and it's fun.
Before we move on though, it reminds me of a lot of the weird stuff that Nintendo was doing with the Game Boy at the time, like the Mario.
hmm
I can't remember the name of it right now, but the Mario game that was on the Game Boy. Where you save. It's not Paulina. It's the other.
So
Not
Daisy, no,
it's Daisy. It's Daisy.
is it?
Yeah,
Okay.
and you like go to space to save Daisy. Like it's a totally different team working on it, and they're like, I don't know what Mario is supposed to be. I feel like Nintendo did a lot of that with this Zelda too on the Game Boy. They
Yeah.
were able to take some liberties with the IP that
hmm
later became these series staples.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's gonna bring us to our next game, which I think is the sort of prototypical. When you think of 2D Zelda, this is the game most people think of. This is The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, the Super Nintendo entry. Um, Still probably the most played beyond Breath of the Wild. Still probably the most played,
Yeah,
outside of Ocarina and Breath of the Wild, of all the Zelda games. Speedrunners love it. Randomizer playthrough people love it. People that just casually play video games love it. It holds up well. It looks beautiful. Some of the
yeah.
best sprite work Nintendo has ever done is in A Link to the Past.
It's like seared in my memory, that sprite of
hmm
Link.
There's that
It's timeless.
that pink hair, right? That shock of pink hair that he has, which is like
Yeah.
so weird and distinct. Like it's like I don't even think another Zelda did that. Are there other ones where he's got pink for
I
his
don't
hair, but
remember it.
very
They're
distinct,
really
very cool.
they're really showing off the power of the Super Nintendo with
Yeah.
that, right? Oh, he's got pink hair in this one.
And it's essentially two Zelda games in one because the first half of the game you're playing through the light world, and then all of a sudden, what's this? The dark world. You get a whole inverted version of the map with entirely new areas to explore, new dungeons and monsters and items. Um, cool time travel mechanics that would go on, like, or I guess like timeline mechanics, right? That would go on to be a huge part of Ocarina of Time, maybe the most beloved entry of the entire series. Um, and so I think we have to place this one in S tier, right? Like, there's no way
Yeah.
we can't. This
I'll
is
I'll be honest though, I wasn't crazy about the dark mode
really the
Zelda.
Dark World.
Yeah, like yeah, the dark world. I remember the first time I played through it, I thought I was getting to the end of the game and I was like,
Yeah,
well, what is this?
it's
What
so long.
uh,
It's
and
great
it
though.
just keeps going, keeps going. It is very good. I appreciated it more later.
Yeah,
But it's nothing less than an S for
yeah.
that game.
Because I think one of the things that I love is just that opening scene, right? Like from the start, it's just such a compelling game. It jumps you into, you wake up in your bed and there's a thunderstorm going on outside. The princess is pleading for you to come rescue her. You talk to your uncle's missing. You go out to look for him. You end up in the castle dungeon. He's injured,
He's
leaning up
dead.
against the wall. He gives you his shield. You go rescue. You get sword and shield. You go rescue the princess. And then all hell breaks loose, and you're out on your adventure trying to figure out, how to stop Ganon. And it rules. And not to talk on this too long because we got a lot to get through, but I think the nice thing about the Dark World mechanic is it opens up. We talked about puzzles, right? We love puzzles in these games, and it opens up some really unique takes on puzzles that
Yeah.
future games, really still haven't overtaken as far as complexity and interesting design choices, right? Ocarina is probably the second best to me as far as puzzle design goes, but this one's like top tier.
And just to further layer on the compliments of this game, what they were able to do with the Super Nintendo in terms of the dungeons levels,
Mm-hmm.
having enemies on different levels, having treasure chests on different levels, but being able to like go underneath bridges and stuff,
Yeah,
like it added just so much depth
yeah.
to the dungeons
Is
that
it,
the
is it
first game
mode
didn't have.
7? Is that
Yeah, it
the
was the mode
the
7.
mode 7 style for the Super Nintendo? It really shows that off really well, which is great. All right, we got to move on because we got a lot
All
more to
right,
do.
it's an S. It's an
So
S.
that's an S tier, easy picks. We're gonna lump the next couple. We're gonna pair the next couple off. The next two entries in the series, we talked about these in the past. Games that came out on the Game Boy Color that are well regarded within the community. There's a lot of people I know that find these to be some of the best Zeldas ever created, and that is the Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons games. We're gonna pair these together because they're I don't think there's enough, and you could argue against me if you want to, if you want to argue this, but I don't think there's enough to distinguish these two. It's more of a Pokemon situation than
Yeah.
anything else. There are different bosses and different, and but you have to kind of play both to get the whole story, anyways. And so they really are a single entry as far as I'm concerned. Each one has a really interesting, unique mechanic, and they both play a little bit differently. One's a little more puzzle focused, one's a little more combat focused, but overall, I think they're equivalent games as far as quality is concerned. These are Capcom developed, right? These are some of these are the first Capcom developed Zeldas. Um,
And
for
I
me,
haven't played both of them, to be honest. I have never played Seasons. I played Ages,
well,
but
if you've
not
played Ages,
Seasons.
I think you're still qualified to talk through this. I've played through both of them. I think they're phenomenal games. I'd put them in A tier just because I don't see them as a dip in quality from Link's Awakening. I think they're equivalent to Link's Awakening, and so that's why I would leave them in the A tier. Because if we're putting Link's Awakening in the A tier, I think these have to go alongside it.
I Okay, so I agree with you in terms of quality, and I think I'm okay with A level. But the only thing I would consider when moving them to a B level is you had to play both to get the entire story.
Mhm.
I think
Yeah,
that was kind of lame.
yeah, I could see that being, but I think that each one could be a self-contained narrative that you would enjoy should you choose to only play one. I don't think it was a
Yeah,
requirement to play two. And that's why I'd be hesitant to drop them because as standalone games, I do think each is still satisfying. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
I'm okay with A level for
We'll leave
those.
them here
That's
now. If we need to adjust them later, we can.
all
Um,
right. All right. I'm good with that.
but that brings us to our next pairing, which is Four Swords and Four Swords Adventure. So the original Four Swords came out with the Link's Awakening on, was it Game Boy Color? Game Boy Advance? I forget.
Advance, I
Game Boy
think.
Advance, I think. Yeah. Um, and it was a pack-in basically. It was a multiplayer pack-in, but it was a full experience. The second one was, I believe, the GameCube. Is that the Four Swords Adventures? Was it on the GameCube?
Yeah, I believe so.
Um, and these are multiplayer Zelda games. Like that's the only way to talk about it. They're the original was very hard to play unless you had friends with link cables and close proximity to play. There was modes in, I don't know if the first one even had a mode to do single player, but later on you could control, like by switching between, in later games you could switch between different links to complete the puzzle solo and stuff. But it was not a fun experience. I think these games to me feel almost like our first C tier Zelda games,
Mm,
and it's purely from a accessibility standpoint because they're good games, but they're also not as distinctly Zelda as these other Zelda games are, because they feel more like arcade games to
they're
me.
like Mario Party, but Zelda.
Yeah, I mean, they have dungeons, they have fighting, they have puzzles and items and all of that, but they still feel a little arcadey to me. And the requirement to get the most out of it, to really enjoy it, I think, uh, means having four friends that also want to play and can play with you. And currently, I think another dock against them is they're just not easy to play now.
Yeah, listen, and maybe you will agree with this, but at least when I was playing, back in the day on my Game Boy Advance, most of my friends did not have the same games as me. And
Yeah.
that was the beauty of it because we traded games.
Mhm.
So the idea of having four people with the same Zelda game, in 2000 and 2001, whatever year it was, that just like for in my experience was not the situation, right?
Yeah.
Like I was never going to be around four friends who had the same game.
No, it was tricky. It's hard. They're obtuse games that are not easy to play now. They're again not quite as traditional as some others, and the things they change, I don't think, are changed for the best. So that's why I'd kind of place them in C tier. They're not bad games. They're perfectly good. I've played them. I just they're not memorable like these other ones are, in my opinion. So that's why I kind of put them in the C tier. And that brings us to
Fair.
Minish Cap, a game that we both just recently played. I'm still working through it slowly. You've completed it. Where are you placed in this one, Justin? What are your thoughts after having just recently completed it? What's your initial?
Man, I am so nostalgic for A Link to the Past, but I think Minish Cap is better.
Really?
I think graphics wise, the map, all the items, the puzzles, the bosses, I think Minish Cap might be an S tier Zelda game.
I could almost see that. My hesitation, I got it there for now. It's sitting in the S tier. My hesitation, the reason I don't think I'll drop it because I haven't beaten it yet, right? But I will say it feels a little bit less expansive. It feels a little bit too contained for me in some
Mm.
ways. Like I don't like the constant return, which is weird because when we get to Majora's Mask, we'll talk about Clock Town, which I think is a perfect Zelda environment. I don't actually like the central hub town of Minish Cap that you have to keep returning to and
Oh, why
exploring
not?
through as you go. I don't know, and maybe I'll like it more as I progress. So that's why I'm reserving judgment. But I find the backtracking to be a little bit more obnoxious in this game than I do in others. And again, that may improve. I'm only a couple dungeons in, but I do think the dungeon design is interesting. I think the items so far have been really fun. Though I also take a little bit of issue with um, the shrinking and growing mechanic because it can sometimes be very tedious. It can be used for certain puzzles that feel very tedious. And so that's where my
Yeah.
reservations for putting it in S tier is that there are some friction points for me that I don't feel A Link to the Past has, if that makes
Growing
sense.
up and down is a pain, no doubt about it. The traversal between different parts of the map gets a lot easier the further along you get in the game, which that could still be an issue. But towards the end, you don't really notice it that much. But I think that the final dungeon and the penultimate dungeon are two of the best in the
Yeah.
2D Zelda
It does have
series.
some really good dungeons from what I've seen. So, okay. I'll I'm happy to leave it in the S tier. I know there's a
I
lot of
think
people
it's an
that have
S.
there's a lot of people that have nostalgia for this game and really love it. So, me being someone who can't fully speak to it, I don't feel right dropping it if you feel strongly about an S tier for
I
this one.
I feel strongly about it, and like even without the gameplay, that pixel art, I think the pixel art is the best we've seen in a 2D
I'll
Zelda
agree with
game.
that. I'll agree with that. Capcom just knocks it out of the park with these Zelda games. Get them on more 2D Zelda games. Let's get a new one in Capcom and just come
Yeah,
on.
now
Let's
that
go.
Capcom's back at it and
Yeah,
making decent stuff.
let's see another one. All right, so that brings us to our final two entries. The next one's a divisive entry of the series. This is A Link Between Worlds, the sequel to A Link to the Past. It is a direct sequel, right? It is a fully fledged sequel to A Link to the Past. It introduced the painting mechanic where Link can turn into a little painting and travel on walls, kind of like Paper Mario style.
Pretty
It
cool.
also was the first major shakeup of dungeons in Zelda's franchise in the series history, in which they decided, hey, what if you could just complete the dungeons in whatever order you want? Here's an idea. Here's a shop where you can rent these items and check them out and go complete the dungeons using borrowed items, which was hit or miss for some people.
Yeah.
I personally love this game. I think it's very good. I think it's a suitable successor to A Link to the Past. I don't think it's as good. Um, but I also know that some people really hated the item system in this, really didn't like the paint system in it. So I would put it A tier, but I could see others arguing that this is a B tier Zelda game. I mean, do you have thoughts on this?
Just that I'm leaning towards B because I feel like A is sort of holy ground for some of those other ones that I
Hmm.
really think are better than this one. Um, I really didn't like the item system. I didn't like renting
Yeah.
items.
Yeah.
It was interesting because it opened up the world more.
Mhm.
Um, but I think there's something to in a game like this having sort of a structure where you work through.
Right.
You don't sequence break.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know. What are your thoughts about that? Like, I like the freedom that it gives you, but at the same time, like I think that a lot of the previous games built on like dungeons built on each other in a way
Mhm.
that you don't really get with this one.
This might be silly to say, but I don't think we would have Breath of the Wild without A Link Between Worlds. And that's
Yeah, that's
kind of
fair.
my what I think elevates this game is I do think it took some swings with the Zelda formula that didn't work for everybody, but so did Breath of the Wild. But I don't think Breath of the Wild would have taken those swings if A Link Between Worlds hadn't performed well. And it did. It sold well. People liked it. It reviewed largely well. Um, not everyone was a fan of it, but it was enough that Nintendo saw that there was an appetite for games that could switch up that sort of like holy formula of
Hmm.
uh, boomerang bombs, hook shot, right? Like bow and arrow, in that order kind of thing. But um, yeah, I mean, I have nostalgia and fondness for this game, so I'm more, you know, ready to put it up in the A tier. But I could see that this list does need some middle ground items. And if I'm looking at the list, out of everything that we got placed, I think this is the one of the A tier that I would feel most comfortable dropping down. Because I do think
That
I like the Oracle's games better than this. So
that's how I feel too. Like on its own, if you just asked me about this game, it'd be A tier. But in relation to everything else, I think it's a B.
okay, all right, we'll put it in the B tier, and that's where it will stay. And that brings us to our last game, which I think we can do pretty quick here. Is Triforce Heroes. This is essentially the 3DS equivalent of the Four Swords games, though it's only three this time. Though I think it's A, more fun than the Four Swords games, and B, learned a lot about the multiplayer from the Four Swords games. It's easier. It's an easier multiplayer experience. You can play it, in proximity to people with 3DSs. Pretty much everyone owns a 3DS. That's a Nintendo fan. So the you know access to multiplayer was easier, and even the single player, not great, more playable, I would argue,
Yeah.
than any of the Four Swords games. So I would probably bump this also up to a B tier. Like, it got to move the Four Swords. It's got to be higher than the Four Swords. Um, and now I'm looking at it, I'm like, but is a link between worlds is way better than this though. So what do we do? Do we slide Four Swords down to the D tier and put Triforce Heroes at the C tier, or do we just accept that Triforce Heroes can sit next to A Link Between Worlds, and that's fine?
Doesn't seem right to me, man. I think we have to move Four Swords down to D.
Okay, I'm fine with that. I'm not a big fan of those games. Like I said, I think there's a lot of I've talked a lot about friction in games. How I don't like when there's systems that impede just like the simple enjoyment of jumping in and playing. And Four Swords are definitely games that do that in a way that irks me. So I don't have fond nostalgia for those games, except for one or two multiplayer experiences with friends. But other than that, I'm fine moving those down to the D tier.
And mainly it's because of the gimmick. Like Nintendo forces the multiplayer on you for
It
some
just
of
didn't
those
work.
games.
It just
And it
didn't
just
work
didn't
on this one.
work.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So here's our tier list, the definitive Nintendo Watcher 2D Zelda tier list.
And yours
In
might be different.
in the
Yours is
S tier,
probably different.
it most likely is. In the S tier, we've got Zelda 2, The Adventures of Link, Zelda: A Link to the Past, and Zelda: The Minish Cap. The three best 2D Zelda games, bar none.
Two of
Those are
them
the top
anyway.
tier. Yeah, Minish Cap we could jump down if we needed to. And then in the A tier, we've got the original Zelda, Legends of Zelda for the Nintendo Entertainment System, Link's Awakening for the Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Switch, and the Oracle's games for the Game Boy Color. In the B tier, we've got A Link Between Worlds, the sequel to Link to the Past for the Nintendo 3DS. Triforce Heroes makes its appearance on the C tier. And in the D tier, bringing up the rear, is the Four Swords and Four Swords Adventures games. That's it. That's the Nintendo ranking for the 2D Zelda games. If you've got issues with this list, if you want to, tell us what you would have changed or how you would have redesigned this list, feel free to, drop some comments in the below the video, and hit us up on social media with your thoughts on our Nintendo Watcher 2023 2D Zelda rankings.
Yeah. Please do. It feels like a solid list to me, but you might disagree. So we'll see.
Yeah.
All right. Matthew, let's take it to our game recommendations of the week. What you been playing? What are you recommending?
So I'm going outside of Nintendo this week. Now, well, I'm going to do two. One, Future Redeemed. If you are a Xenoblade fan, now I know, Justin, you had a hard time at the start. I don't know how your opinions have changed. We haven't talked since then. If you are a fan of Xenoblade, if you've played any of the three games, well, if you've played Xenoblade Chronicles 3, obviously don't play it if you haven't, but if you've played Xenoblade Chronicles 3, you're probably invested enough. Play Future Redeemed. I rolled credits on it last night. I stayed up till 1 in the morning playing it because I couldn't put it down. It is just a whole Xenoblade game. It's a full Xenoblade game as far as
I
I'm
was going to
concerned.
ask how many hours you put into it.
23 hours. I put
Okay.
23 hours into that. Now, that is 23 hours for what is essentially a $40 DLC, or was it $30? How much was the DLC
I
for
think it
that?
was 30, but it
30?
came with a lot of stuff.
But you're buying it for Future Redeemed, if we're being
Yeah.
honest. So a $30 DLC for 23 hours of gameplay. 23 hours that I enjoyed from start to finish. Now, I know we'll get into more of this later, probably in another like video or something, but it just feels like it does stuff with the Xenoblade Chronicles 3 formula that shake it up in ways that make it fun to dip back in. It changes up combat and mechanics and union attacks and stuff like that in interesting ways. It changes the way you level up and skill out your characters. Some of it is dumbing down, but in ways that make for more
Yeah.
compelling late game. I think make for more compelling gameplay decisions, micro decisions, and stuff like that. So I don't want to spoil anything other than to say that I think it is everything that Takahashi, the creator of the Xeno series, has wanted to do for a very, very long time. And I
Hmm.
think it makes for a very bright future for this series. So,
I'm enjoying it, but I will say that the beginning is slow. Was really slow for
yeah,
me.
yeah, I think
Like you
that's
have to
fair.
be purposeful about getting through it. As soon as I saw Shulk, I was in, but it took a while.
Yeah, I think that's fair. So the the reality is, um, this particular DLC, it's only for fans. It's only for long-time invested players, and it pays off a little bit late. That's the big thing. So that's one recommendation. The other recommendation, if you're not playing Nintendo, if you like mobile games, if you like Genshin Impact, there's a new game that came out from MiHoYo. I know, a very divisive company because of their microtransaction gotcha mechanics and whatnot, called Honkai Star Rail. It is a fantastic turn-based gotcha game. It's a fully fledged turn-based RPG with a deep story, interesting mechanics, and a really cool style. It's free. It's free to play. You can spend money in cash shops for draws on the gotcha system, stuff like that. But I will say, the characters that they give you just out the gate, and as you progress the story, are perfectly suitable for getting through the game. You don't have to spend a single penny if you don't want to. In fact, I haven't spent any money on it, and I've put dozens of hours into it at this point, and it's a lot of fun. So that's my
Nice.
other recommendation, Honkai Star Rail.
All right. So for me, outside of Future Redeemed, that I am enjoying now, I've been playing a lot of Trinity Trigger. Um,
Nice.
and I mean, if you were into Secret of Mana on the Super Nintendo,
Mm-hmm.
this is a game that's in a similar style. Lots of the developers and the artists and the musicians will be familiar to you.
Yeah.
It's an action RPG that uses that familiar ring system from the Secret of Mana. I'm really
Nice.
enjoying it. It's about a 20-hour game, so it's
Oh,
not going
longer
to
than I
take you.
thought.
Yeah, it's a little longer than I expected too, but it's not like a 30 or 40 hour deal. Really, really enjoying it. At first, when I started playing it, I thought, man, this kind of feels like a mobile game, but it starts to expand in some really satisfying ways after I don't know, about 30, 45 minutes.
Yeah.
The dungeons are
Nice.
cool. It's not it like I was thinking about this earlier before we started the pod, and I was thinking about what my recommendation was going to be. It's a dumb game in a really great way. Like you can just put this on and kind of zone out. The story is not important. The dungeons don't have these really complicated puzzles. It's really
Mm-hmm.
just a really satisfying game to go through that you don't need to think too much about.
Nice. Nice.
Like
Yeah.
almost like a traditional, action RPG.
It looks a lot of fun. I mean, I've heard good things about it from the people that I've heard have been playing through it. There's just so much out right now that I haven't picked it up, but I may down the road pick it up and check it out. It does look like a lot
It's
of
a
fun.
weird time right now. There's just so much, and then Tears of the Kingdom this
Right.
month. Like it's too much, too many
Yeah.
games.
It's really hard. It's really hard to kind of figure out exactly what to do with this. But that said, hey, check it out if you're into the Mana series, because again, we don't get a lot of games like that anymore. We haven't seen a lot in that vein recently, so I would recommend checking it out.
I've been thinking about that game as part of a trilogy, an unofficial trilogy.
Hmm.
So Chained Echoes, Trinity Trigger, and then Sea of Stars. Like these three RPG game, like retro inspired RPG games that have some DNA, like literally DNA
Yeah,
from some of the people who are around for the Super Nintendo. So for me, like I'm just outside of Chained Echoes enough to really appreciate this game,
right.
and it's got me looking forward now to Sea of Stars.
Yeah, yeah. Sea of Stars, I'm very excited for. We've talked about this a lot. Yeah, I'm curious. I may check it out at some point. I mean, if you're recommending it based off of all the stuff that you've just said, it seems like it's worth at least looking into.
Yeah, for sure. All right, guys, let's leave it there. It's been a long pod, but a good pod. Matthew, great talking as always, and we'll be
Pleasure.
back in your feeds next week.
See ya.